At 82 years old, Mr. Arthur was the target of jokes throughout the entire town. Everyone laughed when they saw him climbing the mountain with his worn boots and a lantern that barely illuminated his steps. But while his neighbors called him the crazy old man, Arthur was about to silence them all. He found a hidden entrance that time had tried to erase for centuries. 24 hours after entering that cave, silence took over the town, and the mockery transformed into a regret that no one would ever forget. Stay with me, because what Arthur brought from those mountains wasn't just a treasure. It was proof that some secrets should never have been buried. And if you enjoy stories that prove the impossible happens, join our community by clicking the subscribe button. Arthur Whitman had lived in Silver Creek for 63 years, ever since he'd moved there fresh out of college, with a geology degree and dreams of discovering something remarkable in the Rocky Mountain foothills. He'd worked for the Colorado Geological Survey for 40 years, mapping rock formations, analyzing mineral deposits, and documenting the region's rich geological history. He'd never made the big discovery he'd dreamed of, never found the vein of gold or the rare mineral deposit that would make headlines. He'd just done his job, raised his daughter with his late wife Margaret, and retired at 65 with a modest pension and a head full of knowledge about every rock formation within 100 miles. Margaret had died 7 years ago. Their daughter Sarah lived in Seattle with her own family, and Arthur, at 82, spent his days in the small house on Elm Street, surrounded by maps and journals and boxes of rock samples that Sarah kept telling him to throw away. The town had changed around him. Silver Creek had once been a mining community, built on silver and copper extraction in the late 1800s. But the mines had closed decades ago, and now the town survived on tourism. Hikers and climbers coming to explore the mountains, staying in bed and breakfasts, eating at restaurants that served craft beer and organic salads. The old-timers like Arthur were relics, curiosities, occasionally trotted out for historical society meetings, but mostly ignored. What really bothered the townspeople, especially the younger generation, was Arthur's obsession with Silver Peak. The mountain loomed over the town, its distinctive pointed summit visible from everywhere. Arthur had been hiking it since he'd first arrived in Silver Creek, and he'd never stopped, even at 82. 3 times a week, weather permitting, he'd lace up his ancient hiking boots, fill his canteen, grab his battered compass and hand-drawn maps, and head up the trail. The young people found it ridiculous. They'd pass him on the mountain, jogging by in their technical gear with GPS watches and Camelback hydration systems, and they'd shake their heads at the old man with his antiquated equipment. Some of them would make jokes just loud enough for him to hear. "Hey, Grandpa, you know they invented phones that tell you where you are now, right? Careful, old-timer. Wouldn't want you getting lost up there. Someone should really put him in a home before he breaks a hip." Arthur never responded. He'd just keep walking, one steady step after another, his lantern swinging from his pack even in daylight because he never knew when he might need it. The worst of them was Travis Morrison, a 28-year-old real estate developer who'd moved to Silver Creek 5 years ago and immediately started buying up property. Travis had his eye on Arthur's house and the 2 acres it sat on, prime development location, close to downtown, mountain views. He'd made Arthur 3 offers, each more generous than the last, and Arthur had refused them all. That's when Travis started getting nasty. He'd started a campaign to paint Arthur as a public safety risk, a senile old man who was going to get himself killed on that mountain and waste taxpayer money on search and rescue. He'd brought it up at town council meetings, had written letters to the local paper, had even started a petition to require anyone over 75 to pass a physical competency test before being allowed on hiking trails. The petition hadn't gone anywhere, but it had succeeded in making Arthur look foolish. The whole town knew about Crazy Arthur and his treasure maps. They knew he spent his evenings poring over old mining surveys and geological reports, convinced that there was something up on Silver Peak that everyone else had missed. They knew he believed in a legend that most people had forgotten, a story about a hidden cave system that had been sealed by a rock slide in the 1880s, supposedly containing crystals so pure and large they glowed in the dark. Old miners' tales, Folklore, nothing more. Except Arthur believed it was real. He had evidence. Documents from the Colorado Geological Survey archives, journal entries from miners, geological surveys that showed unusual formations on Silver Peak's north face. He'd spent years triangulating locations, studying erosion patterns, analyzing how a century of weather might have changed the mountain's face. And 3 months ago, after a particularly heavy rainstorm had caused minor mudslides, he'd seen something while hiking, a gap in the rock face, barely visible, that hadn't been there before. He'd marked it on his map, measured the location, documented everything in his journals, and he'd been planning ever since, waiting for the right moment to investigate further. The mockery had gotten worse lately. Last week, Travis had confronted Arthur in the grocery store parking lot. "You know what everyone's saying, Arthur? They're saying you're a danger to yourself. They're saying maybe it's time for your daughter to step in, put you somewhere safe where you can't wander off and get lost." Arthur had looked at the younger man with steady eyes. "I've been hiking this mountain since before you were born, son. I know every trail, every rock formation, every change the seasons bring. I'm not lost. You're chasing fairy tales. There's no hidden cave. There's no treasure. There's just an old man who can't accept that his best years are behind him." "My best years," Arthur had said quietly, "are the ones where I'm still curious enough to seek the truth. I hope you find that out someday." But Travis's words had stung because they echoed what Arthur heard everywhere, at the coffee shop, in the post office, even from well-meaning neighbors who suggested he take up something safer, like birdwatching or watercolors. The message was clear. He was too old, too foolish, too stuck in the past. What none of them understood was that this wasn't about treasure or glory or proving anything to anyone. This was about completing something he'd started 63 years ago when he'd first arrived in Silver Creek with wonder in his eyes. This was about answering a question that had occupied his mind for decades. This was about the simple, pure joy of discovery that had made him become a geologist in the first place. And now, looking at his maps spread across the kitchen table on this particular Friday evening in late September, Arthur made his decision. Tomorrow. He would go tomorrow. Not because he was trying to prove anything to Travis or the town, but because the weather forecast showed clear skies, because his knee had been feeling better this week, and because at 82 years old, he knew that tomorrow was never guaranteed. He started preparing methodically. Fresh batteries for the lantern, water purification tablets, energy bars, his emergency beacon, the one thing he'd conceded to modern technology, though he'd never had to use it, his climbing rope just in case, his journal and camera to document whatever he found. He packed it all carefully into his old canvas rucksack, the same one he'd used for 40 years of field work. As he worked, he thought about Margaret. She would have understood. She'd been the one person who'd never thought he was crazy, who'd looked at his maps and journals and said, "Well, we'll just have to find out, won't we?" She'd believed in him even when he didn't quite believe in himself. He wished she could be here for this. Tomorrow, one way or another, he'd have his answer. He'd either prove that the cave existed, or he'd finally be able to let go of a dream he'd carried for too long. Either way, it would be closure. What he didn't expect was that by tomorrow night the whole town of Silver Creek would be transformed, and he would have proven something far more important than the existence of a cave. Arthur woke at 4:30 a.m. before his alarm. He'd barely slept, too full of anticipation and nervous energy. He made himself eat a full breakfast, oatmeal with nuts and dried fruit, 2 eggs, toast. At 82, he couldn't skip meals before physical exertion. His body needed fuel. He dressed in layers. The September morning would be cold at elevation, but he'd warm up as he climbed. Long underwear, hiking pants, moisture-wicking shirt, fleece, windbreaker. His worn boots. He'd probably hiked 5,000 miles in these boots, and they fit like old friends. By 5:30, he was ready. He left a note on the kitchen table just in case with his planned route and expected return time. Then he shouldered his pack, 25 pounds heavier than he usually carried, and headed out into the pre-dawn darkness. The streets of Silver Creek were empty and quiet. Arthur walked through town toward the trailhead, his lantern unlit, relying on the street lights and the faint glow of approaching dawn. He passed Travis Morrison's new development, a row of modern townhouses that had replaced a historic boarding house. He passed the coffee shop where the young hikers would gather in a few hours. He passed the elementary school, where he'd once given talks about geology to wide-eyed third graders who thought rocks were boring, until he showed them geodes split open to reveal purple crystal interiors. He reached the trailhead just as the sky was beginning to lighten. The sign there warned hikers to register, to bring appropriate gear, to check weather conditions. Arthur had done all of it 1,000 times. He started up the trail. The first mile was easy, a well-maintained path through pine forest. Arthur moved steadily, not fast but not slow either, the pace he'd perfected over decades, one that he could maintain for hours without exhausting himself. His breathing was even, his steps sure. This was muscle memory, his body remembering how to do this even at 82. As he climbed, the town fell away below him. The forest began to thin. By mile 2 he'd gained significant elevation, and the views opened up, Silver Creek spreading out in the valley, the river winding through it, catching the first rays of sunrise. It was beautiful. It was home. It was worth protecting, worth understanding. By mile 3 his knees were complaining a bit, but nothing he couldn't manage. He stopped to drink water and eat an energy bar, looking out at the mountain above him. Silver Peak's distinctive pointed summit was still another 2 miles up the main trail, but Arthur wasn't going to the summit. He was heading to the north face, to a section of the mountain that most hikers never visited, because it was off-trail, rocky, difficult. That's where he'd seen the gap. That's where the old mining surveys suggested a cave system might have existed. He left the main trail at mile 3.5, following cairns he'd built on previous hikes to mark his route. This was rougher going, scrambling over rocks, pushing through low brush, navigating by landmarks and his compass. The GPS hikers with their phones wouldn't have managed this well. Technology was useless without understanding terrain. But Arthur had been reading land formations his whole life. He knew how to navigate. An hour past the main trail, as the sun cleared the eastern peaks and lit up the mountain in golden light, Arthur reached the spot he'd marked on his maps. The north face here was a confusion of rocky outcrops, loose scree, and ancient weathered formations, a geologist's playground, a hiker's nightmare. And there, just as he'd noted 3 months ago, was the gap. It was subtle. You could walk past it 10 times and never notice. It looked like just another shadow in the rock face. But Arthur had spent decades studying rock formations, understanding how they eroded, how they fractured, how they revealed what lay beneath. He approached carefully. The gap was narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, and vertical like a crack in the mountain's face. He shone his lantern into it. The beam disappeared into darkness, showing no immediate back wall. That was promising. He checked his watch. 7:15 a.m. He'd made good time. He had at least 8 hours before anyone would worry about him. He took out his journal, documented the location with compass bearings and photographs. Then he studied the gap more carefully. It was tight, but not impossibly so. His pack would barely fit through. He tested the stability of the rock around the opening. Solid. Not a recent formation, but something ancient, revealed by the gradual erosion of softer rock around it. This was it. This was the entrance he'd been seeking. Arthur took a deep breath. He thought about Margaret, about all the years of searching, about every person who'd called him crazy. Then he lit his lantern, adjusted his pack, and squeezed through the gap into the mountain. The passage was tight for about 10 feet, forcing Arthur to turn sideways and shuffle through with his pack scraping against rock on both sides. Then it opened up into a space large enough to stand. Arthur swept his lantern around. He was in a passage, roughly 6 feet wide and 8 feet tall, that angled downward into the mountain. The walls showed tool marks. This had been excavated by human hands, probably in the 1880s. This was a mine shaft, or the beginning of one. The ceiling showed signs of a collapse at some point. Broken timbers, fallen rock. But the passage itself was clear. Someone had mined here and then abandoned it, and the entrance had eventually been concealed by rockfall. Arthur moved forward carefully, testing each step. The passage descended at a gentle angle, going deeper into the mountain. After about 50 feet, it opened into a larger chamber. Arthur stopped, raised his lantern, and gasped. The chamber was roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across, and it was filled with crystals. Not just small crystals, but massive formations jutting from the walls and floor, clear quartz and amethyst clusters, some as large as a man, catching his lantern light and throwing it back in 1,000 fragmented rainbows. It was breathtaking. It was real. The miners had been right. Arthur stood there for a long moment just looking, letting the reality sink in. He'd found it. After 63 years in Silver Creek, after decades of studying this mountain, after months of planning this trip, he'd actually found it. The cave wasn't just real, it was spectacular. He moved around the chamber, examining the formations with a geologist's trained eye. The crystals had grown slowly over millennia, in a perfect environment. Mineral-rich water seeping through the rock, depositing layer after layer of silica in this protected cavity. The chamber must have been created by some ancient volcanic activity or tectonic shift, and then conditions had been perfect for crystal formation. This was rare. This was valuable. This was scientifically significant. This was exactly what he'd hoped to find. But there was more. At the far end of the chamber, Arthur noticed another opening. He approached it carefully. This passage was natural, not excavated, and it led deeper into the mountain. Arthur checked his watch. 7:45. He had time. He had to know what was down there. He followed the natural passage, which twisted and turned, sometimes requiring him to crouch, sometimes opening into smaller chambers. And in one of those chambers, about 100 feet from the main crystal room, Arthur found something that stopped him in his tracks. On the wall, illuminated by his lantern, were handprints, not modern spray paint or graffiti, ancient handprints in red ochre, preserved perfectly in the dry air of the cave. Surrounding them were symbols he didn't recognize, pictographs in the same red pigment, showing what looked like animals, humans, the sun and moon. This wasn't just a geological wonder. This was an archaeological site. The native peoples who'd lived in this region before European settlement had known about this cave. They'd used it, possibly for ceremonies, possibly as a refuge. They'd left their mark here, and time had preserved it perfectly. Arthur sat down on a smooth rock, overwhelmed. He'd been looking for crystals and mine shafts, for geological proof of his theories. He'd found that and more. He'd found evidence of human history that predated the mining era by hundreds, possibly thousands of years. This cave needed to be protected, studied, preserved. This was bigger than anything he'd imagined. He spent the next several hours documenting everything, photographs from every angle, detailed notes in his journal about the crystal formations, their size and quality, the geological conditions, careful documentation of the pictographs, with scale references and multiple angles. He collected small rock samples, labeled them meticulously. He measured the chambers, drew maps, recorded everything a trained geologist would need to verify and study the site. He worked methodically, taking breaks to eat and drink, managing his energy. At 82, he couldn't work at the pace he'd once maintained, but he could work carefully and thoroughly. The cave was cool, maybe 55 degrees, and protected from weather. He was comfortable. Time passed in that strange way it does when you're completely absorbed in work. Arthur would look up from his notes and realize an hour had passed. Then another. The chamber didn't change. His lantern created a bubble of light in the eternal darkness, and outside that bubble, the mountain kept its ancient secrets. Around 3 p.m., Arthur realized he was getting tired, really tired. He'd been awake since 4:30. He'd hiked 3+ miles up a mountain, and he'd been working in the cave for 7 hours. His knee was aching. His back hurt. He needed to head out soon if he was going to make it back to the trailhead before dark. But he was satisfied. He had enough documentation. He had proof. Tomorrow he could bring this to experts. Geologists from the Colorado Survey, archaeologists from the university, proper authorities who could secure the site and begin formal study. Tomorrow everyone in Silver Creek would know that crazy Arthur had been right all along. He gathered his materials, took one last look around the crystal chamber, committing it to memory, this magnificent secret that the mountain had kept for so long, and headed for the exit. That's when things went wrong. Arthur was maybe 20 feet from the narrow entrance passage when he heard the sound, a deep grinding noise from somewhere above and outside the cave. Then a rumble, then a crash that shook the entire chamber and brought down a shower of small rocks and dust from the ceiling. Arthur froze, his heart pounding. He waited until the shaking stopped, until the dust began to settle. Then he moved carefully toward the entrance passage. The narrow gap he'd squeezed through was gone. In its place was a pile of fresh rubble, rocks that had fallen from above the entrance, sealing it completely. Arthur stood there, staring at the rockfall, and felt the first touch of real fear. He was trapped inside the mountain. The cave entrance was completely blocked. Arthur examined it carefully, moving rocks, trying to find a gap, any opening to the outside. Nothing. The rockfall had been substantial. Hundreds of pounds of stone had tumbled down from somewhere higher on the mountain face, probably disturbed by thermal expansion as the afternoon sun heated the rock. Wrong place, wrong time. Pure bad luck. Arthur sat down on a boulder, his mind racing through options. He could try to dig his way out, but that might take hours and could trigger another collapse. He had his emergency beacon, but he'd have to be outside the mountain for it to work. The signal couldn't penetrate solid rock. He had his cell phone, but predictably, there was no signal inside the mountain. Think, Arthur. Think like a geologist. There had to be another way. He went back into the cave, to the natural passage that led deeper into the mountain. If there was one opening to the outside, there might be another. Cave systems often had multiple entrances. He followed the passages methodically, mapping as he went, looking for any hint of outside air, a draft, a temperature change, a shaft of natural light. He found several more chambers, each with its own geological wonders, more crystals, a small underground stream probably fed by snowmelt, another set of pictographs, but no exit. He'd been searching for 2 hours when his lantern started to dim. The batteries were running low. Arthur had extra batteries, but they were limited. He needed to conserve power. He turned off the lantern and sat in complete darkness for the first time since entering the cave. The darkness was absolute. Not just dark, but utterly, completely black, in a way that surface darkness never is. No stars, no moon, no distant lights, just nothing. Arthur sat in that darkness and forced himself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help. Fear wouldn't help. He was tired and trapped, but he wasn't injured. He had water, food for at least another day, the stream for more water if needed. He could survive here for a while. The question was whether anyone would find him. He thought about the note he'd left. It said he'd be back by dark. When he didn't return, Sarah would be called. Search and rescue would be activated. They'd find his car at the trailhead. They'd follow the main trail, maybe find where he'd left it to head cross-country. But would they find this cave? Would they even think to look for it? Not likely. He'd kept his theories about the cave secret, hadn't told anyone where exactly he planned to search. The north face was huge. They could search for days without finding this specific spot, especially now that the entrance was concealed by fresh rockfall. Arthur turned the lantern back on, using it sparingly. He had to be realistic. His best chance of getting out was to find another exit or wait for rescue, and the wait could be long. He needed to prepare for that. He spent the next few hours setting up a survival camp in the crystal chamber. He rationed his remaining food. He filled his water bottles from the underground stream, using purification tablets. He found a level spot to rest. He conserved his batteries, keeping the lantern off except when absolutely necessary, and he waited. Outside the mountain, day turned to evening, though Arthur had no way to know that. Inside the cave, time became meaningless. He slept fitfully, woke, ate a little, made more notes in his journal by lantern light, slept again. In his dreams, he was young again, hiking with Margaret, showing her the crystals, hearing her say, "I told you, Arthur. I told you it was real." When he woke, he didn't know if it had been hours or days. His watch said it had been 12 hours since the rockfall, which meant it was around 3 a.m. Outside, search and rescue had almost certainly been activated. They were probably on the mountain right now, calling his name, sweeping areas with flashlights. And he was here, trapped inside the mountain, with one of the most significant discoveries of his career, unable to tell anyone. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd finally proven he wasn't crazy, and no one would ever know because he'd die alone in this beautiful, terrible cave. No, Arthur shook off the thought. He wasn't giving up. Not yet. He stood, stretched his aching joints, and started exploring again. There had to be another way out. The mountain wouldn't defeat him. Not after all this. Not when he was so close to showing everyone that some things were worth believing in, even when the whole world called you crazy. In Silver Creek, the alarm had been raised around 9 p.m. Friday night, when Arthur failed to return from his hike. Sarah, calling from Seattle for their usual Friday evening check-in, got no answer. She called the neighbor, who found Arthur's note and his car still at the trailhead. Sarah called the sheriff. By 10 p.m., Silver Creek's volunteer search and rescue team was mobilizing. By midnight, they were on the mountain. The team was led by Mike Henderson, who'd been doing mountain rescue for 20 years. He knew Arthur, knew his hiking habits, knew he was experienced, but also 82 years old. We're looking for a solo hiker, elderly male, probably somewhere between the trailhead and the summit. He's an experienced hiker, but he's been out since early morning. Check the main trail first, then we'll expand the search pattern. They searched through the night, calling Arthur's name, sweeping the trail with powerful flashlights. They found nothing. No sign of him, no indication of where he might have left the main trail. At dawn Saturday, they expanded the search. More volunteers arrived, dozens of people from town who wanted to help despite the hour. Even some of the young hikers who'd mocked Arthur showed up, feeling guilty now that he was actually missing. Travis Morrison arrived at 7 a.m., looking haggard. "This is my fault," he told Mike. "I called him crazy, told him he should be in a home. If he got himself hurt trying to prove something..." "This isn't about fault," Mike said. "This is about finding him." They searched all day Saturday. Helicopter flyovers, dogs tracking scent from Arthur's house, teams combing increasingly remote sections of the mountain. They found nothing. By Saturday evening, the mood was grim. Mike knew the statistics. A missing hiker, elderly, overnight in the mountains, now over 36 hours missing. The chances of finding him alive were dropping with every hour. Sarah flew in from Seattle Saturday night. She stood in her father's house, looking at his maps spread across the kitchen table, and tried to understand what he'd been thinking. Where had he gone? Her father wasn't senile. He wasn't careless. If he'd gone somewhere specific, he'd had a reason. She studied the maps, noted his markings, the calculations, the notes in his distinctive handwriting. He'd been focused on the north face of Silver Peak. Why there? The search continued Sunday. More volunteers, more resources, more desperation. The town of Silver Creek seemed to collectively hold its breath. In the coffee shop, people who'd laughed at Arthur a week ago now talked about his geology presentations, his kindness, his dedication. In church, they prayed for his safe return. Travis Morrison, overcome with guilt, organized a donation drive to support the search and rescue costs. The same people who'd signed his petition to restrict elderly hikers now signed a new petition demanding better trail markers and emergency protocols. The whole town seemed to realize simultaneously that they'd failed Arthur long before he'd gone missing. They'd mocked him, dismissed him, treated him like an embarrassment instead of a treasure. Mike Henderson knew they were running out of time. Sunday afternoon, he made the decision to expand the search to the remote North Face areas, despite the difficult terrain. "It's a long shot, but we've covered everything else. We need to check it." At 4 p.m. Sunday, exactly 48 hours since Arthur had entered the cave, a search team reached the North Face section where Arthur had been working. One of the searchers, a volunteer named Jessica Chen, who actually knew something about geology from college, noticed something odd. "Mike, come look at this." The fresh rockfall was obvious once you knew to look for it. Rocks that had tumbled down recently, their surfaces not yet weathered, sitting in a pile that didn't match the surrounding ancient formations. "Think someone could be under that?" Mike asked. Or inside, Jessica said. Look at how the rocks fell. They're blocking something. Maybe a gap or opening. They started carefully moving rocks, aware that any disturbance could trigger another collapse. It took an hour of cautious work, and then they saw it, the gap, the narrow passage leading into the mountain. Mike shone his flashlight into the opening. Arthur Whitman, can you hear me? From deep inside the mountain, faint but unmistakable, came a response. I'm here, I'm all right, I'm here. The search team erupted in cheers. People were crying, hugging each other. Someone radioed the news down to base camp. We found him. Arthur's alive, he's inside the mountain. It took another 30 minutes to clear enough rocks for Mike and Jessica to squeeze through the gap. They found Arthur sitting in the crystal chamber, looking exhausted but alert, his lantern barely glowing from dying batteries. About time you showed up, Arthur said with a weak smile. I was starting to think I'd have to find my own way out. Mike laughed, relief washing over him. Jesus, Arthur, you had us all scared to death. Are you hurt? Just tired and hungry. And my knee hurts, but I'm okay. Then he looked at both of them seriously. But before we leave, you need to see something. You need to understand why this matters. He led them through the chamber, showing them the crystals first. Jessica gasped. My God, Arthur, these are incredible. Wait, Arthur said. There's more. He showed them the pictographs, the archaeological evidence, the geological formations, the underground stream. Everything he documented over the past 48 hours. This whole mountain needs to be protected, Arthur said. This isn't just a pretty cave. This is scientifically and culturally significant. We need archaeologists, geologists, proper preservation protocols. We need to do this right. Mike was on his radio calling for additional resources. We're going to need university people up here. We're going to need experts. This is bigger than a rescue now. They helped Arthur out slowly, carefully. He was stiff from 2 days in the cave, dehydrated despite the stream water, exhausted from stress and lack of sleep. But he was alive, and he was coherent, and he was still giving instructions about how to protect the site as they maneuvered him through the narrow passage and out into the afternoon sunlight. The moment Arthur emerged from the mountain, the assembled crowd of searchers broke into spontaneous applause. Someone wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. Someone else handed him water. Sarah pushed through the crowd and hugged her father carefully. Dad, you scared me to death. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I got trapped, but I found it. I actually found it. I don't care about the cave, Dad. I care about you. I know, but Sarah, it's real. Everything I believed was real. They got him down the mountain on a stretcher, despite his protests that he could walk. At the trailhead, an ambulance was waiting. The paramedics checked him over, dehydrated, exhausted, some mild hypothermia, but overall remarkably good shape for someone who'd spent 48 hours trapped inside a mountain. As they loaded him into the ambulance, Arthur noticed Travis Morrison standing at the edge of the crowd, looking stricken. Arthur caught his eye and nodded. No anger, no triumph, just acknowledgement. They drove Arthur to the hospital in Denver, an hour away for a full evaluation, and behind them, up on the mountain, Mike Henderson and Jessica Chen were already establishing a perimeter around the cave entrance, making sure no one disturbed the site before experts could arrive. Word was spreading, not just that Arthur had been found, but what he'd found. By the time the ambulance reached Denver, news crews were already heading to Silver Creek. The story was too good to ignore. Elderly geologist trapped for 2 days discovers archaeological and geological wonder. Arthur's ordeal was about to become national news. The hospital kept Arthur overnight for observation and IV fluids. Sarah stayed with him, and they talked for hours, about Margaret, about his years in Silver Creek, about why this discovery mattered so much to him. I spent my whole career doing good work, but never great work, Arthur explained. Never the discovery that makes people stop and wonder. I was always competent, but never brilliant. And then I retired, and I thought that was it. No more chances. But this mountain kept calling to me, Sarah. This one last mystery. I couldn't let it go. You almost died, Dad. But I didn't. And now we know. The cave is real. The crystals are real. The pictographs are real. Everything I believed was right. By Monday morning, The story had spread nationwide. Arthur woke to find reporters in the hospital waiting room, wanting interviews. The Colorado Geological Survey had sent a team to the cave. The University of Colorado's archaeology department was involved. The National Park Service was discussing landmark status. His doctor cleared him to leave the hospital Monday afternoon. Sarah drove him back to Silver Creek, and the town he returned to was different from the one he'd left Friday morning. A banner hung across Main Street. "Welcome home, Arthur," our local hero. People lined the streets, applauding as Sarah's rental car drove through. The coffee shop had a sign, "Free coffee for life for Arthur Whitman." Even Travis Morrison had put up a sign at his development office, "We were wrong, we're sorry." Sarah pulled up to the house on Elm Street. Neighbors were waiting on the porch with flowers and food and apologies. Mrs. Chen from next door was crying. "We should have believed you, Arthur. We should have known better." "It's all right," Arthur said quietly. "You didn't know. How could you?" The young hikers who'd mocked him were there too, looking ashamed. "Mr. Whitman, we're really sorry for the things we said. You were right about everything." "You're young," Arthur said. "You'll learn. Sometimes the old ways work. Sometimes experience matters more than technology." That evening, Mike Henderson came by with official news. The survey team finished their preliminary assessment. "Arthur, you found one of the most significant crystal formations in Colorado. Those amethyst clusters are museum quality. And the pictographs, the archaeologists are saying they're possibly from the Fremont culture, maybe 1,000 years old, incredibly well preserved. This is a major find. What happens now?" "The cave becomes a protected site, probably fast-tracked for national monument status. There will be research, documentation, eventually maybe limited public access with proper oversight. And Arthur, they want you involved. They want you to consult, to help document everything you saw, to share your knowledge, if you're willing." Arthur smiled. "Willing? Mike, I've been waiting my whole life for someone to ask me that question." Over the next few days, Arthur was interviewed by geologists, archaeologists, reporters, documentary filmmakers. He sat in his kitchen with his maps and journals, explaining his research, his theories, his methodologies. The experts were amazed. His documentation from inside the cave was thorough and professional. His analysis of the geological formations was sound. His preservation of the archaeological site had been careful and respectful. "You did everything right," one geologist told him. "Even trapped and running out of supplies, you treated that cave with the respect it deserved. You didn't disturb anything unnecessarily. You documented properly, you understood the significance. You're a credit to your profession." The town council held a special meeting Wednesday night. The chamber was packed. Travis Morrison stood up first. "I owe Arthur Whitman an apology. I called him crazy. I tried to make everyone think he was senile and dangerous. I was wrong about all of it. I was arrogant, and I'm sorry. I'm donating $20,000 to the Fund for Cave Preservation and Research. It's the least I can do." Others stood up. The young hikers apologized. The shopkeepers who'd mocked him apologized. Even people who'd just laughed privately felt compelled to speak. It was a collective unburdening of guilt. Finally, Arthur was asked to speak. He stood slowly, his body still recovering from the ordeal. "I appreciate the apologies, and I accept them, but I want to say something important. I didn't do this to prove you wrong. I did it because I had to know, because curiosity doesn't have an age limit, because wonder doesn't expire when you turn 65 or 70 or 80. I'm an old man, yes, but I'm an old man who spent his whole life studying this mountain and developing skills and knowledge that young people with their GPS and their apps don't have. Both kinds of knowledge matter. Both have value. Don't dismiss people because of their age. Don't assume that old means irrelevant or incompetent or foolish. I found that cave because I had 82 years of experience to draw on. That's not a weakness. That's a strength." The chamber erupted in applause. Sarah, sitting in the front row, was crying. That night, as Arthur sat on his porch looking at Silver Peak summit silhouetted against the stars, he felt a profound sense of peace, not triumph. He'd never been motivated by proving people wrong, but completion, closure. The question that had occupied him for decades was answered. The mystery was solved. And in solving it, he'd shown that age was not an ending, but a continuation, that the skills and knowledge and persistence developed over a lifetime had value, that curiosity and wonder were timeless. A car pulled up. Travis Morrison got out, approached hesitantly. "Arthur, I know I apologized publicly, but I wanted to do it privately too. I was cruel to you. I dismissed you because you were old and I was young and arrogant. I thought I knew better. I was wrong about everything." Arthur studied the younger man. "You want to know what I learned in that cave, Travis? I learned that the mountain keeps secrets until it's ready to share them. I learned that patience and persistence matter more than speed and technology, and I learned that being right isn't as important as being true to yourself. I wasn't trying to prove anything to you. I was trying to answer a question for myself. How do you not hate me? Because I remember being young and thinking I had all the answers. Because holding on to anger is exhausting at 82, and because I have better things to do with whatever time I have left than waste it on resentment." Travis nodded, tears in his eyes. "Thank you. For what it's worth, you've changed how I see the world. You've changed how I see people." After Travis left, Arthur sat alone with his thoughts. Margaret would have loved this, he thought. She would have insisted they celebrate. She would have made him promise to be careful, and then supported whatever crazy thing he wanted to do next. He missed her, but he also felt her presence in a way that was comforting rather than sad. The mountain had given him a gift, not just the cave, but the validation that he'd been right to keep seeking, keep wondering, keep believing. At 82, Arthur Whitman had proven that the best years weren't necessarily behind him. Sometimes they were just beginning. 3 months later, Silver Peak Cave, officially designated a national monument, opened for limited guided tours. Arthur served as senior consultant on the project, working with younger scientists to develop preservation protocols and public education programs. The cave had been carefully mapped, photographed, studied. The crystals were protected behind barriers. The pictographs were monitored for environmental changes. Everything was done with respect and care. Arthur led the first official tour group, a mix of geologists, archaeologists, and journalists, as he guided them through the crystal chamber he'd discovered, pointing out formations and explaining the geological processes that had created them. He felt a satisfaction deeper than anything his 40 years of regular work had given him. This was his legacy. Not just the discovery, but the proper stewardship of it. Sarah visited from Seattle that Christmas. They hiked up to the cave entrance together, just to the entrance, Sarah insisted, not willing to let her 83-year-old father actually go inside without proper supervision. They stood at the entrance, now properly stabilized and secured, looking out at the view. "Are you happy, Dad?" "I am. More than I've been since your mother died. I have purpose again. I have work that matters. And I get to show young people that old geologists still have something to contribute. The university wants to name a research fellowship after you. Did they tell you?" They mentioned it. Margaret would have laughed. All those years of competent but never brilliant work, and now they want to put my name on something. "You were always brilliant, Dad. You just needed the right mountain." They hiked back down together slowly, Arthur setting the pace, Sarah matching it. The town below was decorated for Christmas, lights twinkling in the gathering dusk. It looked beautiful, welcoming. It looked like home. The following spring, Arthur gave a lecture at the University of Colorado about the discovery. The auditorium was packed. Students, professors, geology enthusiasts, even some of the people from Silver Creek who'd once mocked him. He spoke for an hour about the cave, the research, the ongoing work. But he ended with something more personal. "I'm 83 years old. I've had a good life and a long career, but the work I'm most proud of happened in the last year. Not because the discovery was important, though it was, but because I proved something to myself. I proved that it's never too late to be curious, never too late to seek answers, never too late to believe in something even when everyone else thinks you're crazy. When you're young, people tell you that you can be anything, do anything, that the world is full of possibilities. But when you're old, people tell you to slow down, be careful, accept your limitations. I'm here to tell you that's wrong. The world is still full of possibilities at 83. Wonder doesn't expire. Curiosity doesn't retire. The desire to understand, to discover, to learn, that's timeless. My advice to young people: respect your elders not because we're fragile and need protecting, but because we've spent decades developing skills and knowledge you haven't acquired yet. Learn from us. Listen to us. Value what we know. And my advice to older people: never stop asking questions. Never stop exploring. Never accept that your best years are behind you. They're not. They're right now. Every day you wake up curious is a best year. The audience stood and applauded for 5 full minutes. Arthur stood there overwhelmed, thinking about Margaret, about the mountain, about the journey that had brought him to this moment. After the lecture, a young geology student approached him. "Mr. Whitman, I'm writing my thesis on crystal formation. Would you be willing to be interviewed? I'd love to learn from your experience." "I'd be honored," Arthur said, and he meant it. That summer, on the anniversary of his discovery, Silver Creek held Arthur Whitman Day. There was a parade, speeches, a ceremony where the mayor presented him with a key to the city. The young hikers who'd once mocked him had organized a charity climb to raise money for geological education. Even Travis Morrison had founded a scholarship for elderly people pursuing continuing education. Arthur stood on a platform in the town square, looking at the crowd. Hundreds of people celebrating not just his discovery, but what it represented. He thought about the Friday morning a year ago, when he'd left his house before dawn, when everyone had thought he was crazy, when he'd had only his maps and his conviction to sustain him. He thought about Margaret, who'd believed in him always. He thought about the mountain which had kept its secrets until exactly the right moment to reveal them. And he thought about the message he wanted to leave, the truth he'd learned not just from finding the cave, but from surviving it, from the town's reaction, from everything that had followed. When it was his turn to speak, he kept it simple. "A year ago, I was just a crazy old man chasing fairy tales. Today I'm proof that age is not a limit but a tool, that experience matters, that persistence pays off, that wonder is eternal. The mountain taught me that. The cave proved it. Thank you all for finally believing, but more importantly, thank you for learning. The vision of a person is not measured by what their eyes can see, but by what their soul knows to seek." Later that evening, Arthur sat on his porch with Sarah, looking at Silver Peak's summit outlined against the sunset. "Do you think Mom would be proud?" Sarah asked. "I think she'd say, 'I told you so,'" Arthur answered with a smile. "She always believed I'd find it. She just didn't live long enough to see it happen." "She saw it," Sarah said. "Wherever she is, she saw it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching darkness fall on Silver Creek. The town lights came on below. The mountain stood eternal above. And Arthur Whitman, at 83 years old, felt like his life was just beginning. Thank you for listening to Arthur's story. I'd love to know, where in the world are you hearing this from? Drop a comment and let me know your location. Stories like Arthur's remind us that inspiration can come from anywhere, and I'm curious where our community of dreamers spans across the globe. End. The months that followed brought Arthur a kind of peace he hadn't known since Margaret's death. He woke each morning with purpose, spent his days consulting on the cave preservation project, teaching young geologists about rock formation analysis, and sharing his decades of field experience with anyone willing to listen. The university offered him an emeritus position, unpaid but prestigious, giving him office space and access to their research facilities. He accepted gratefully, spending Tuesday and Thursday afternoons there, surrounded by students who now sought him out for advice rather than mocking him for his age. He became a mentor to several graduate students, teaching them not just geology, but the patience and persistence required for meaningful discovery. Travis Morrison proved his apology was genuine by becoming Arthur's unlikely friend. He'd visit weekly, bringing coffee, asking about the cave project, listening to Arthur's stories about the old days in Silver Creek. "I learned something from you," Travis said one afternoon. "I learned that rushing to develop everything, to modernize everything, to replace everything old with something new, that's not always progress. Sometimes the old things, the old ways, the old wisdom, they matter. They teach us things we'd lose otherwise. Arthur appreciated that. Not just the apology, but the genuine change in perspective. The cave discovery had transformed more than Arthur's reputation. It had shifted how Silver Creek viewed its past, its elderly residents, its relationship with the mountain. The town established a historical preservation committee. They started recording oral histories from long-time residents. They created a museum dedicated to local history, with Arthur as its founding board member. The mockery that had defined his final years became respect. The isolation became community. The dismissal became valued contribution. But Arthur knew the real gift wasn't the recognition. It was the proof that his instincts had been right, that his life's work had value, that age had enhanced rather than diminished his abilities. One evening, hiking up to the cave entrance with a group of visiting geologists, Arthur paused at the viewpoint where he'd stopped on that Friday morning 2 years ago. The same view, the same mountain, but everything different now. A young geologist named Maria stood beside him. "Mr. Whitman, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How did you keep believing when everyone said you were wrong? How did you maintain that certainty for so many years?" Arthur thought about that. "I didn't always maintain certainty. Some days I doubted myself completely. Some days I thought maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a stubborn old man chasing fairy tales. But I had evidence. Not proof, but evidence. Research, documentation, logic. And I had experience reading mountains. I trusted that experience more than I feared being wrong. And honestly, even if I'd been wrong about the cave, the searching mattered. The process mattered. The refusal to stop being curious mattered. The discovery validated the search, but the search had value even without the discovery." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "I hope I'm still that curious when I'm your age." "You will be," Arthur said, "if you nurture it. Curiosity is like a muscle. It atrophies if you don't exercise it. Keep believing that there are still mysteries worth solving. That's how you stay young regardless of your age."